Stop believing whatever your uncle told you at the last family gathering about where your surname really comes from. Almost every explanation floating around Jamaican genealogy groups right now is a shortcut. It's just the plantation owner's name, that's it, nothing more. And that shortcut is robbing you of the actual story sitting in the archive. The 1817 registers were not some casual list. They were forced, detailed, triennial returns that the Jamaican Assembly had to keep after the slave trade was outlawed in 1807. And they capture something far messier than the one-line myth your family repeats. Free people who chose their own surname on purpose. Merchant families nobody expects. Enslavers whose own workers split into 3 completely different surnames on the same estate. Names that don't even belong to that era at all. Today, we're counting down 17 Jamaican surnames from 17 to 1 and giving you what the record actually says, not what a comment section assumed. Stay for number 1. It flips almost everything people think they know about who really built Jamaica's surname map. Quick thing before we count down. If your surname shows up anywhere in this list, or even if it doesn't, drop it in the comments right now. I read every single one, and the names that come up the most become full deep dive episodes. And if you actually want to trace your own family through records like the 1817 returns instead of just guessing, subscribe, because that's the whole purpose of this channel. One surname at a time, straight from the record. Surname 17. Sangster. Sangster is not a slave owner's family name in the way most people assume. It's an occupational surname from Scotland, built from sang, meaning song, essentially meaning the singer or the chorister, someone who led music in a parish church centuries before Jamaica ever entered the picture. Scottish families carrying occupational names like this crossed to Jamaica's north coast in large numbers through the 1700s, many settling around what's now Montego Bay, running smaller estates rather than the massive sugar empires further east. The name spread through those estates the way most North Coast names did, attaching itself to the enslaved and later free population working that land. What most people don't realize is how far this name eventually traveled in Jamaican history. Sir Donald Sangster became Jamaica's second prime minister, and Sangster International Airport carries the name into the present day. So when this surname turns up in a family tree, it isn't pointing to one dramatic slave owner villain. It's pointing to a Scottish parish tradition of naming people after what they did, transplanted onto Jamaican soil, and then claimed by a nation. Researchers tracing a Sangster line often find the trail runs through several smaller North Coast holdings rather than one single estate, which fits the pattern of modest Scottish landholding on that side of the island. A useful reminder that not every surname story needs a massive plantation behind it to be worth researching properly. Surname 16. Vassell. Vassell looks like an ordinary English surname until you follow it into the property records, where the Vassell family appears again and again as absentee owners of multiple Jamaican sugar estates, running their holdings from England while overseers manage daily life on the ground. This is exactly the kind of name the 1817 registers are built to expose. Because absentee ownership meant the surname on the estate deed and the surname eventually carried by the people registered on that estate could be identical, even though the family whose name it was never set foot on the island. That distinction matters. A vassal in the register wasn't necessarily naming a face they'd ever seen. They were naming a distant landlord, a business entity as much as a person. For descendants today, that's actually useful information. The surname tells you which absentee dynasty owned the land your ancestors were forced to work, which is a very different research trail than chasing a resident planter who actually lived on the property. Surname 15, Segree. Segree is one of those names that makes people assume a typo or a made-up spelling. But it's a real, distinct Jamaican surname with roots most researchers trace to French Huguenot refugee families. Protestant French families fled religious persecution across the 17th and 18th centuries. and a meaningful number of them ended up in Britain's Caribbean colonies rather than staying in continental Europe, bringing surnames that then got anglicized, respelled, and folded into parish records over a couple of generations. By the time the 1817 registers were compiled, a name like Segree had already been passed down through free and enslaved households alike on the estates connected to those refugee-descended families. This is exactly the kind of surname that gets flattened into probably British by lazy genealogy content when the real trail runs through France, then a refuge in Britain, then finally Jamaica, 3 migrations deep before the name ever touches the island. Surname 14. Facey. Facey traces back to English West Country roots, most likely from a Norman-derived surname tied to a place name. The kind of tight, compact English surname that shows up disproportionately in parish records from Somerset and Devon. Families carrying that name crossed to Jamaica as part of the wider wave of English settlers running smaller sugar and provision estates, particularly inland and in less glamorous parishes that don't get nearly as much attention in the popular telling of Jamaican plantation history. That's actually the important part here. Most surname content obsesses over the huge, famous estates, but the 1817 registers cover everything, including modest holdings that never made it into any history book. A name like Facey is a reminder that a huge share of Jamaica's population history runs through these smaller, quieter properties, not just the handful of massive estates everyone already knows. Surname 13. Chin. Here's the twist this list needed. Chin will not appear in the 1817 registers at all, and that absence is the entire point. Large-scale Chinese migration to Jamaica didn't begin until indentured labor schemes started in the 1850s, decades after slavery's registers were compiled and years after the trade itself had already been abolished. Families carrying this surname arrived under an entirely different system, indenture contracts, not enslavement, and built an entirely separate chapter of Jamaican history, one centered on shopkeeping, trade, and eventually deep integration into Jamaican civic and cultural life. If your surname is Chin, tracing your 1817 origin is a dead end by design. And that's actually a more honest answer than forcing a fake connection just to keep a pattern going. Not every Jamaican name has to fit the same story to belong on this island. Surname 12, Manning. Manning is an English surname built on an old Anglo-Saxon personal name, and in Jamaica it's tied to something a lot more specific than most people expect. Manning School in Westmoreland, founded from a bequest by an English merchant named Manning back in the 1700s for the education of poor children in that parish. That's a documented piece of Jamaican civic history, not folklore, and it means the surname carries an institutional footprint most planter names never got. Enslaved and later free people connected to Manning-linked estates and endowments picked up the name through exactly the pattern you'd expect from the registers, attached to land, attached to a benefactor, then carried forward for generations after the benefactor himself was long gone. It's a good example of how one surname can point toward philanthropy and education just as easily as it points toward ownership. Surname 11, Genus. Genus sits in a smaller, more specific category. Surnames brought into Jamaica by French-descended free people of color, many arriving as refugees during and after the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804. Jamaica absorbed a wave of displaced French and French Caribbean families fleeing the upheaval in Saint-Domingue, and those families brought names, skills, and sometimes considerable wealth with them, settling mostly around Kingston and the eastern parishes. Names like Genus moved through those communities and into the 1817 registers as part of a household that had already crossed one Caribbean colony before landing in another. This is a genuinely underused thread in Jamaican surname history. Not every French-sounding Jamaican name traces to Huguenots 2 centuries earlier. Some of them trace to a much more recent, much more violent revolution just one island over. Surname 10, Malcolm. Malcolm is a Highland Scottish clan name from the Gaelic for devotee of St. Columba. and it landed in Jamaica through one of the most consistent patterns in the whole colonial record: Scots working as overseers, bookkeepers, and estate managers, rather than as the estate's actual owners. After the Acts of Union, and through the economic pressure of the Highland clearances, huge numbers of Scottish men took jobs managing Caribbean estates because opportunities at home had collapsed, and they brought clan surnames with them that then attached to the enslaved population under their supervision. This is worth sitting with for a second. A name like Malcolm often doesn't point to the wealthy absentee owner living comfortably in London. It points to a working overseer, himself, often just one generation removed from being pushed off his own land, now enforcing the same system on someone else's. Surname 9. Hilton. Hilton is an English and Scottish border region surname, a variant of Hilton, meaning settlement on the hill. The kind of purely descriptive toponymic name that tells you almost nothing about wealth or status and everything about geography. Families with this name settled across several Jamaican parishes rather than clustering around one famous estate, which means the surname doesn't trace back to one single dramatic origin story. It traces to dozens of smaller ones scattered across the island's landscape. That's actually typical of a huge share of Jamaican surnames, and it's exactly why the 1817 registers matter so much for a name like this. Broad surname content will just guess English, probably a planter. But the register can actually pin down which specific parish and which specific property your Hilton line connects to. We're exactly halfway through the list, and if you're realizing your family's version of the story doesn't quite match what's actually in these records, that's normal. That happens on almost every single surname we cover. Hit subscribe now if you haven't, because the back half of this list gets even bigger, including a national hero's actual surname and the community most people completely leave off these lists. And comment below which number surprised you the most so far. I want to know before we keep going. Surname 8. Kerr. Kerr comes from one of the most powerful border clans in Scottish history, a name tied to centuries of Anglo-Scottish border conflict long before it ever touched the Caribbean. Kerr families crossed into Jamaica as both estate owners and estate managers, and the name shows up repeatedly across parish and property records, attaching itself to enslaved households the same way most Scottish surnames did on the island, through direct ownership or through supervisory control. What makes Kerr worth pulling out specifically is how often it appears alongside other border clan names in the same district, suggesting tight-knit Scottish networks that recruited each other into Caribbean estate work, family by family, almost like a pipeline running from the Scottish borders straight into Jamaica's sugar economy. Surname 7. McFarlane. McFarlane comes from Clan McFarlane, a Highland clan centered around Loch Lomond, and its path into Jamaica runs through the exact same displacement story as several other Highland names on this list. Jacobite unrest, then the clearances, pushing Highland families toward colonial opportunity because there was increasingly little opportunity left at home. Clan-based Highland names like this one tended to spread widely once established on an estate, because Highland social structure carried strong ideas about kinship and loyalty that didn't simply vanish when a Highlander became an estate manager overseeing enslaved people thousands of miles from home. The 1817 registers pick up McFarlane households across multiple parishes, which tracks with how mobile these Highland-connected families tended to be within the colony, moving between properties as opportunities shifted. Surname 6. Hibbert. Hibbert is not a background name in Jamaican history. It belongs to one of Kingston's most prominent merchant families, and Thomas Hibbert specifically built Headquarters House in downtown Kingston back in 1755, a building that still stands today and has served multiple functions in Jamaica's civic life since. The Hibbert family's wealth ran directly through the sugar and trading economy, connecting Jamaican plantation profits to merchant houses back in Britain, which means this surname sits right at the intersection of colonial commerce and colonial ownership. Households connected to Hibbert-owned or Hibbert-financed properties carried the name into the 1817 registers, and descendants researching this line are often surprised to learn just how visible and well-documented the family actually was. This isn't an obscure planter. It's one whose actual building you can still walk past in Kingston today. That level of documentation actually works in a researcher's favor. Merchant families like the Hibberts kept far more detailed paper trails than smaller rural estates ever did, which means a Hibbert connection in the 1817 registers often opens up years of additional correspondence, shipping records, and account books that most other surnames on this list simply don't have surviving anywhere. Surname 5. Sharpe. Sharpe is the name of an actual national hero, and if this surname belongs to your family, that connection is worth taking seriously rather than treating as coincidence. Samuel Sharpe, enslaved in the parishes around Montego Bay, organized and led the 1831 to 1832 uprising now known as the Baptist War, a rebellion that historians widely credit as a major turning point pushing Britain toward abolishing slavery across its empire just a few years later. Sharpe was executed in 1832, and today his face appears on Jamaican currency, and his name marks a major public square in Montego Bay. The 1817 registers predate the rebellion by more than a decade, but they capture the same estates and the same surname network that Sharpe himself emerged from, meaning this name doesn't just carry an ordinary plantation-era story, it carries a direct line to one of the most consequential acts of resistance in Jamaican history. Surname 4. DeLisser. DeLisser is a French Huguenot origin surname that made a very specific mark on Jamaican intellectual life through Herbert George DeLisser, a journalist and editor who ran the Daily Gleaner in the early 20th century and wrote The White Witch of Rose Hall, one of the most widely read Jamaican novels of its era. The family's roots trace back through the same Huguenot refugee pattern as several other French-descended names on this list, arriving in Britain first before eventually settling in Jamaica generations later. What makes this name distinct is the shift it represents, from plantation-era origin to a 20th century media and literary legacy, showing how a surname story doesn't stop at emancipation. It kept moving, kept mattering, and eventually shaped how Jamaica told stories about itself. Surname 3. Nunes. Now we get into territory almost no surname video covers properly. Nunes is a Sephardic Jewish surname, Portuguese in origin, carried by families who fled the Inquisition, many rooting through Brazil or the Netherlands before eventually settling in Jamaica from the mid-1600s onward. Jewish merchant families built one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities anywhere in the Americas right there in Jamaica, and they became deeply embedded in the island's port trade, shipping, and later civic institutions. This matters because the dominant surname narrative online treats every Jamaican name as either English, Scottish, or African in origin, completely erasing this entire diaspora thread. A name like Nunes isn't a footnote. It's evidence of a persecuted community that survived by crossing an ocean, then another sea, and building something lasting on an island most people never connect to Jewish history at all. Surname 2. Lindo. Lindo is another major Sephardic Jewish Jamaican family name, and the Lindo family specifically became significant players in the island's sugar and rum trade, while also playing an active role in Jamaica's civic and religious life for generations. Kingston's Shar Shalom Synagogue, still known for its distinctive sand-covered floor, connects directly to this same Jewish community's history. A tradition some historians trace back to the Inquisition era, when Jewish worship in Spain and Portugal had to be conducted quietly, without noise that could draw attention. A surname like Lindo carries that entire weight: persecution, secrecy, survival, and then generations of open, prominent community life once Jamaica offered something closer to safety. That's a completely different kind of true origin than anything a plantation-only narrative can offer. Surname 1. Silvera. And here's the surname that should completely reframe how you think about this whole list. Silvera is a Sephardic Jewish Jamaican surname carried by families whose roots run through Spain and Portugal, through the Inquisition, through refuge in places like Amsterdam or Brazil, and finally into Jamaica not long after England took control of the island in 1655. This community became merchants, traders, and eventually pillars of Jamaican commerce and civic life, and their descendants are still part of Jamaica today, carrying names most surname content completely ignores in favor of the same handful of English and Scottish planter stories repeated over and over. That's the real reveal here. The loudest version of Jamaican surname history, the version almost every other video on this topic is built on, leaves out an entire diaspora that helped shape the island for nearly 4 centuries. If your surname is Silvera, your family isn't a footnote to someone else's plantation story. You're carrying one of the oldest continuous threads in the entire Western Hemisphere. That's the list. 17 surnames, 17 very different roads into Jamaica, and at least 3 of them probably weren't in your head 5 minutes ago. If you made it this far, you already know this channel isn't doing the lazy version of this content. Subscribe if you want the next batch of surnames covered with this same level of actual research, and comment your surname below, whether it made this list or not. I'm building future episodes directly from what shows up in these comments, so the more specific you are, the better chance your name gets its own deep dive. Like this video, if it changed how you think about your own name, share it with the one family member who's always asking about your last name at every gathering, and I'll see you in the next one.